In a small, conservative village in Morocco, the life of Amina, a 27-year-old Muslim woman, was lived under the shadow of a marriage that was increasingly suffocating her. From a young age, Amina had learned that her role in life was predetermined: to be an obedient wife, to respect her husband and to uphold her family's reputation. Her marriage to Youssef, a deeply religious and strict 34-year-old man, had been arranged by their respective families when she was just 19 years old. Youssef was known in the community as a devout follower of Islam. He spent hours at the mosque, led neighborhood prayers and made sure that traditions were kept alive. His public image was impeccable, an upright man who followed religious teachings to the letter. However, inside his home, life was very different. Amina, although she respected her religion, dreamed of something more than the four walls of her house. She was an intelligent and curious woman, but her days were filled with endless household chores and obeying Youssef's orders. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the way she dressed to the people she could talk to. The few times she left the house, it was only with her husband's approval, and always under his supervision. Although early in their marriage Amina accepted these restrictions as part of her duty, over time she began to feel trapped. Her relationship with Youssef was cold and distant. He saw his wife as an extension of himself, someone whose only purpose was to fulfill his responsibilities as a wife and mother. Although they had no children, Youssef constantly reminded her that her primary obligation was to stay home and prepare for the day when they would have offspring. Amina spent most of her days cleaning the house, cooking, and praying. The hours seemed endless, and the only conversations she had were with her husband, who rarely paid attention to her. Deep down, Amina longed for something more, something that would give her life meaning. She looked back with nostalgia to the days before she was married, when she could spend time with her friends and dream of a future full of possibilities. Her friends, those who had not been forced into such strict marriages, seemed to lead much happier lives. Some had managed to study, others worked, and several had found husbands who treated them with respect and affection. Amina tried to convince herself that she should accept her fate, but with each passing day, she felt her frustration growing like a storm about to break. The control that Youssef exerted over Amina was total. He checked her phone when she had it, although she was rarely allowed to use it. He forbade any contact with men, even distant relatives, and was always on the lookout for any behavior he deemed inappropriate. Despite his religious and calm image, Youssef had an explosive temper. It was enough for something not to go his way for him to start yelling or even breaking things at home. Amina tried to avoid conflict, but she found it increasingly difficult to bear the constant reproaches and restrictions. The relationship, which had never been passionate, was becoming an emotional prison for her. Sometimes, while cleaning the house or preparing dinner, she would dream of a different life, one where she could make her own decisions and be free. The first time Amina considered defying Youssef's rules was during a family wedding. Youssef had insisted that Amina wear a traditional outfit that covered her entire body, including a veil that left just her eyes visible. Although Amina had always complied with the dress code, that night she decided to wear a more modern dress that she had received as a gift from a cousin. The dress, while respectful of tradition, was tighter and left her arms exposed. When Youssef saw Amina in the dress, his reaction was immediate. "What are you doing? Do you want to embarrass me in front of my family?" he shouted at her, taking her aside before they could enter the wedding hall. Amina tried to defend herself, saying that the dress was modest and that she saw nothing wrong with wearing it. But Youssef wasn't willing to listen. Eventually, he forced her to change in the car before allowing her in. That experience left Amina humiliated, but it also lit a spark inside her. For the first time, she realized that she didn't want to live the rest of her life under Youssef's rules. That night, as she tried to sleep, she began to think of ways to regain some control over her life. In the village, Amina and Youssef's life was the subject of constant gossip. Although no one dared to openly criticize Youssef for fear of his influence in the mosque, it was clear that many looked upon Amina with pity. Some women, especially the younger ones, tried to include her in their social activities, but Youssef always found an excuse to keep her at a distance. "You don't need friends who distract you from your duties," he would tell her. Despite the restrictions, Amina managed to maintain contact with one of her childhood friends, Layla, who lived in a nearby town. Layla, who had been lucky enough to marry a more liberal man, was one of the few people Amina could talk openly to. Although their conversations were brief and sporadic, Layla always reminded Amina that she deserved better. "How long are you going to continue living like this?" Layla asked her in one of their conversations. Amina, unable to answer, simply sighed. She knew Layla was right, but she didn't see a way out. Or so she thought. One day, while Youssef was at the mosque, Amina decided to go out to the market alone. Although she knew he wouldn't approve, she needed a break. Walking through the market was one of the few activities that brought her some happiness. The voices of the vendors, the aroma of the spices, and the hustle and bustle of the people made her forget, if only for a moment, her life at home. It was at that market that Amina began to notice something she had never considered before, that the world was much bigger than she had imagined. She saw foreign tourists walking freely, women dressed differently, and couples who seemed genuinely happy. That contrast made her question her own situation even more. Although she didn't do anything particularly rebellious that day, something inside Amina changed. For the first time, she began to consider the possibility of seeking her own happiness, even if it meant defying Youssef. The following weeks were marked by increasing tension in Amina's home. She tried to hide her frustration, but Youssef could tell something had changed. "Why are you so quiet lately?" he asked her one day. Amina, not knowing what to say, simply shook her head. But inside her, the seed of rebellion had already sprouted. She began to come up with small plans to regain some of her freedom. Sometimes, she would go out to the market under the excuse of buying ingredients, but in reality she would stroll the streets, enjoying the feeling of being away from Youssef's controlling gaze. Other times, she would lock herself in the bathroom with her phone to read articles about women who had managed to escape similar situations. With each passing day, Amina felt more determined to change her life. Although she knew she would face consequences if Youssef found out, she was willing to risk everything for a little happiness. What she didn't know was that this path would lead her to unimaginable tragedy. The change in Amina did not go unnoticed by Youssef. Although she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, she sensed that her wife was becoming more distant, more self-absorbed, and she began to suspect that something was wrong. As Youssef tightened his control, Amina became more resourceful in finding moments of freedom. These small acts of rebellion filled her with an adrenaline rush she had never experienced before. For the first time in years, Amina felt like she was taking charge of her life, even if it was clandestinely. It all began with a simple outing to the market, similar to those she had made before. But this time, Amina decided to walk beyond the usual areas. She ventured into a square where tourists and expatriates gathered. She observed men and women talking freely, laughing, and enjoying a freedom she could barely imagine. Among them, her attention was drawn to a young American, Jake, who was sitting in a cafe reading a book. Jake was unlike anyone Amina had ever met. His light brown hair and relaxed expression made him stand out in the crowd. Although they didn't exchange words that day, something in Jake's gaze caught her attention. Amina returned home with her heart racing, unable to get him out of her mind. It was the first time she had felt anything like attraction since she had married Youssef. That night, as Youssef recited his prayers, Amina couldn't stop thinking about the young man she had seen in the square. Days later, Amina found the perfect excuse to return to the square. She told Youssef that she needed to buy ingredients for a special dinner. With his permission, she dressed in her abaya and hijab and left the house. But instead of going to the market, she headed straight to the cafe where she had seen Jake. To her surprise, Jake was there again, this time talking to a group of tourists. Amina sat at a nearby table, pretending to read a menu while trying to listen to the conversation. It was then that Jake noticed her presence and smiled at her. Amina, feeling embarrassed, quickly looked away. However, Jake got up from his table and approached her. "Hi, do you mind if I sit here? It seems like all the tables are full," he said in clumsy but understandable Arabic. Amina, surprised by his boldness, nodded shyly. For the next few minutes, Jake tried to strike up a conversation, asking questions about the place and the local culture. Although Amina was nervous, she found herself answering his questions with a mix of curiosity and caution. That encounter was brief, but it left a deep impression on both of them. Jake was fascinated by Amina's elegance and intelligence, while she was drawn to his kindness and carefree way of speaking. When Amina returned home, she carried with her not only the ingredients she had bought as an alibi, but also a sense of excitement she had never felt before. From that day on, Amina began to look for excuses to return to the square. Every time she did, Jake was there, as if fate was pushing them to meet. Little by little, their relationship grew from a simple conversation into something much more personal. Jake shared details about his life in the United States. His love for photography, his passion for traveling, and his interest in learning about other cultures. Amina, for her part, told him about her life under Yusef's strict rules, though without revealing too many details. With each meeting, their connection grew stronger. Jake began to see her as more than a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. He saw in Amina a strong and courageous person who was fighting for her freedom. For her part, Amina felt alive in a way she had never experienced before. With Jake, she could be herself, without fear of being judged or controlled. The breaking point in their relationship came one afternoon when they both decided to walk together in a nearby park. Amina, nervous but excited, took off her hijab as they walked through a secluded area. Jake, surprised by her gesture, told her, "You are beautiful." Amina, blushing, tried to change the subject, but Jake took her hand and stopped her. At that moment, their eyes met, and without saying a word, Jake leaned in and kissed her softly. For Amina, that kiss represented everything she had been searching for: love, freedom, and a sense of identity. Even though she knew what she was doing was dangerous, she couldn't help but give herself over to that moment. From then on, Amina began to lead a double life. During the day, she still fulfilled her duties as a dutiful wife, tending to Yusef and keeping up appearances. But secretly, she looked for any opportunity to meet Jake. They would spend hours together, exploring the city and sharing dreams and desires that Amina had never been able to express before. However, this double life began to weigh on her. Every time she was with Jake, she felt like she was betraying her husband and her religion. But when she was at home with Yusef, she felt like she was betraying herself. This internal struggle grew more intense with each passing day, especially since she knew Yusef would find out sooner or later. Yusef, who had always been a controlling man, began to notice changes in Amina's behavior. She no longer seemed as submissive as before, and she often made excuses to leave the house. Although Amina was careful, she couldn't help but make small mistakes that fueled her husband's suspicions. One night, while checking Amina's phone, Yusef found a message from an unknown number. Although the message contained nothing incriminating, it was enough to raise his alarms. From that moment on, Yusef began to watch his wife more closely, looking for any sign of betrayal. Amina, for her part, began to feel cornered. She knew Yusef was watching her, but she couldn't give up Jake. He was her only source of happiness in a world that had suffocated her for so long. Finally, the day came when everything fell apart. Amina and Jake had planned to meet at a hotel to spend a few hours together away from the prying eyes of the town. Amina, as usual, made up an excuse to leave the house, but this time, Yusef decided to follow her. He suspected something was not right and was determined to find out the truth. When Amina arrived at the hotel and entered Jake's room, she had no idea that Yusef was right behind her. Upon opening the door and finding his wife with another man, something in Yusef snapped. Rage and humiliation blinded him completely, and without a second thought, he pulled out a knife he had with him. The hotel room, which until then had been a haven of love and freedom for Amina, became a scene of horror. Yusef, his eyes bloodshot with rage, burst into the room brandishing a knife. Jake and Amina barely had time to react before Yusef's fury caught up with them. Yusef first lunged at Jake, shouting insults in Arabic, accusing him of having stolen his wife and besmirched his honor. Jake tried to fight back, but Yusef's strength, fueled by his rage, was overwhelming. The knife found its mark several times, leaving Jake severely injured. Amina, horrified, tried to stop her husband, begging him to stop. "Please, Yusef, stop. Don't do this," Amina screamed, as she tried to pull him away from Jake. But her words only fueled Yusef's anger. "You are to blame for this," he shouted, turning to her. "You brought this shame on our home." Amina tried to escape, but Yusef's fury gave her no respite. He attacked her with the same violence, not listening to her pleas or cries of pain. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but in that time, Yusef ended both their lives. The room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by Yusef's labored breathing and the echo of his victims' last screams. After committing the murders, Yusef stood paralyzed, staring at the bloodied bodies of his wife and the young foreigner. For a moment, he seemed to realize what he had done. However, instead of giving himself up, he decided to flee. He wiped the knife on Amina's clothes, put it in his pocket, and left the hotel in a hurry, trying not to attract attention. The hotel staff, alerted by the screams coming from the room, called the police. When the officers arrived, They found the macabre scene. The bodies of Amina and Jake were lying on the floor, surrounded by blood. The hotel's security cameras had captured Youssef entering and leaving the premises, making it easy to identify him. Youssef did not manage to get very far. He knew that the authorities would be looking for him, but in his confused and angry state he had no clear plan. He tried to hide in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the town, but the police found him a few hours later. When they arrested him, he offered no resistance. "I did what I had to do. She betrayed me," he said coldly as officers handcuffed him. News of the murders spread quickly through the village and the region. Neighbors, who had always seen Youssef as a devout and respectable man, were shocked. Many could not believe that the man who led prayers at the mosque was capable of such a violent act. Youssef's trial became a national event. The details of the case, from Amina's forbidden relationship with Jake to the brutality of the murder, kept the audience in suspense. During the trial, Youssef was unrepentant. "What I did was to defend my honor and that of my family. She broke the rules and paid the price," he told the court. However, Youssef's arguments did not convince the jury. The prosecution presented compelling evidence, including CCTV footage and testimony from hotel staff. In addition, defense lawyers were unable to justify the extreme violence Youssef had used. The testimony of Jake's family, who had traveled from the United States to attend the trial, was especially heartbreaking. His parents described Jake as a young man full of life and passion, who had been in Morocco to learn about the culture and explore the world. His death was a devastating blow to them, and they demanded justice. On the other hand, Amina's family also expressed their grief. Although they had initially supported Youssef, considering him a victim of his wife's actions, over time they began to question whether his reaction had been justified. "Amina was our daughter. Maybe she made mistakes, but she didn't deserve to die that way," her father said through tears. After weeks of deliberations, the jury found Youssef guilty of double homicide. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although the sentence brought some closure for the victims' families, the damage had already been done. 2 young lives had been lost, and the small town was forever scarred by this tragedy. The case of Amina and Youssef sparked a national debate about the role of traditions and honor in modern society. For many, the story was an example of how cultural and religious restrictions could lead to tragedies if they were not adapted to current times. Others, however, defended Youssef, arguing that he had acted under the pressure of a value system that required him to protect his honor at all costs. In the village, the mosque was divided. Some continued to support Youssef, considering him a victim of Amina's actions, while others rejected him, saying that his behavior had been a betrayal of the principles of his religion. Although her life ended tragically, Amina became a symbol of struggle for many women in similar situations. In the months following her death, several organizations began working on campaigns to empower women and offer them support in oppressive marriages. Amina's story is a reminder that all women deserve freedom and respect, read a statement issued by a human rights group. Jake also left a legacy. His family created a foundation in his honor to promote cultural exchange and understanding between different communities. Jake believed in human connection, in finding beauty in differences. "We want his death to mean something," his mother said during the foundation's inauguration. The small town where the tragedy occurred was never the same. Amina's house was left abandoned, a silent reminder of the events that had shaken the community. People avoided talking about the case, but the scars were evident in every corner of the place. Youssef, locked away in a high-security prison, spent his days reflecting on his actions. Although he never showed remorse publicly, deep inside he began to question whether his sense of honor had really been worth it. But it was too late to change the past.